Hello, this is Dr. Clarence R. Pearson Sr., and welcome to My View, a podcast where I offer my professional perspective on today's most pressing geopolitical and socioeconomic issues. Recently, my attention has been drawn to developments concerning what I fear is the Great Atlantic Rift and the impacts it's having on the world at large. Here is my view on the matter: the Great Atlantic Rift, how the Iran war is reordering the West and the world. The transatlantic alliance is not collapsing in a single dramatic moment. It is splintering through a series of shocks that, taken together, now amount to a historic rupture. The war with Iran, the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, President Donald Trump's open contempt for NATO, and Europe's hurried search for strategic autonomy have pushed the United States, Britain, and the European Union into their deepest security crisis in decades. Reuters reported on April 1st that Trump said he was strongly considering taking the United States out of NATO and described the alliance as a paper tiger. What makes this moment so consequential is not only the breakdown in political trust, it is the collapse of an older assumption that the United States would remain the guarantor of Western security even when allies disagreed. That assumption no longer holds. Britain and Europe are now adjusting to a world in which Washington may initiate major military action without consultation, demand support without reciprocity, and then tell allies to fend for themselves when the global economic consequences arrive. Reuters reported that after the Hormuz crisis intensified, Trump said securing the waterway was for others to resolve, while Britain convened roughly 40 countries to discuss how to reopen it. The immediate trigger is the Iran conflict, but the damage radiates outward through energy, food, inflation, and alliance politics. UNCTAD said on March 30th that shipping through the Strait of Hormuz had fallen by more than 95%, effectively bringing flows close to a standstill, with direct consequences for oil, liquefied natural gas, and fertilizer. The organization described rising risks not only to energy markets, but to food systems, trade, and vulnerable economies. Reuters separately reported that the IMF now sees the war as a global but asymmetric shock that is leading to higher prices and slower growth, with low income countries especially exposed to food insecurity because of higher food and fertilizer prices. This is why the Great Atlantic Rift is not just a diplomatic story, it is a cost of living story. Reuters reported that the International Energy Agency warned Europe would begin feeling the supply losses in April, while US fuel exports surged as Asia, Europe, and Africa sought to replace disrupted Middle Eastern supplies. UNCTAD has also warned that rising transport, energy, and fertilizer costs are feeding directly into future food price pressures. The result is a second wave inflation shock that may hit the global south hardest, even though it played no role in starting the conflict. Europe's response has been shaped by necessity, not ideology. Reuters reported on April 1st that Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the instability caused by the Iran war meant Britain should move toward closer economic and defense ties with Europe, explicitly describing a deeper partnership with the EU as part of Britain's long-term national interest. This is not a formal renunciation of NATO, nor a return to the pre-Brexit order, but it is a major strategic pivot. It reflects a growing European conclusion that US reliability can no longer be treated as a constant. That pivot is occurring through real institutional channels. Britain and the EU already struck a major post-Brexit reset deal in May 2025, including a new security and defense partnership that Reuters described as the most significant repair of ties since Brexit. In March 2026, Reuters reported that European Council President Antonio Costa said Britain and the EU were on course for an agreement linked to Europe's Safe Defense Fund. Official EU calendars also show an informal meeting of heads of state or government scheduled for April 23rd, 2026, underscoring that Europe's response is being organized not through rhetoric alone, but through formal political machinery. The British-led diplomatic effort around Hormuz is especially revealing. Reuters reported that British Foreign Minister Yvette Cooper chaired a virtual meeting of about 40 countries on April 2nd to discuss joint action to reopen the strait, with participants including France, Germany, Canada, the UAE, and India. AP similarly reported that the United States did not participate and that the talks focused on diplomatic pressure and possible future escort arrangements rather than joining Washington's offensive course. This is more than crisis management. It is Europe and its partners attempting to build a non American center of initiative within a Western emergency. France has been unusually direct about the stakes. Reuters reported that Paris told Washington NATO exists for Euro Atlantic security, not for offensive missions in Hormuz, and that President Emmanuel Macron was pushing a UN led approach rather than a military one. That position matters because it marks a refusal not simply to join a war, but to allow NATO itself to be repurposed as an instrument of unilateral US policy outside its core defensive mission. If Europe is moving towards strategic autonomy, the global south is moving towards strategic intervention. Reuters and other reporting now show that countries outside the traditional Western core are no longer merely absorbing the fallout. They are trying to shape the outcome. India has been battling market stress linked to the war. South Korea has publicly engaged with France on reopening Hormuz. UNCTAD has warned that the fertilizer shock threatens agricultural production and trade far beyond the Gulf. In effect, the economic pain of the crisis is pulling middle powers into diplomacy because passivity has become too expensive. This is the deeper meaning of the current disorder. The West is no longer acting as a coherent strategic bloc, and the rest of the world is adjusting accordingly. The old post Cold War model assumed that the United States could discipline the system, Europe could stabilize it, and the global south would mostly adapt. That hierarchy is weakening. In its place is a more fragmented order in which Britain and the EU may cooperate closely without Washington, middle powers may mediate crises the West cannot contain, and essential trade routes may depend on overlapping coalitions rather than a single hegemon. Reuters, reporting on Britain's 40 country initiative and Starmer's pivot toward Europe, suggests that this transition is already underway. The United States still has immense military and economic power, and NATO has not disappeared. But the credibility of the Atlantic system has been damaged by unpredictability, coercive rhetoric, and strategic unilateralism. The result is not yet a post American world, but it is unmistakably a post assumption world. Europe no longer assumes Washington will lead responsibly. The global south no longer assumes the West will act coherently. And ordinary households from Europe to Asia to Africa are learning that the fracture of alliances now reaches all the way to the fuel pump, the food market, and the family budget. The question now is not whether the Atlantic order is under strain. It is whether a new rules-based equilibrium can be built before economic shock, strategic mistrust, and improvisational coalitions harden into a more permanent age of fragmentation. My View is a continuing series where I share informed commentary on a wide range of geopolitical and socioeconomic topics. If you found today's discussion helpful, please follow, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I invite you to explore other My View episodes available online. Until we meet again, goodbye.